Hello there, and welcome to this Patrons event. I'm really pleased that you can join us this afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Catherine Renane, and I'm the Philanthropy Manager here at the National Railway Museum. I'm currently sitting in my front room. But thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's wonderful to have you all here, and for those of you who are spending a lunchtime with us, thank you. We hope that you're all keeping well and safe in this lockdown too. This afternoon, I'm pleased to welcome our Assistant Director and our Head Curator, Andrew McLean, to join us. And I know many of you have met Andrew, and I know he's looking forward to talking about the Intercity 125 with us today. But before I pass over to Andrew, I've got a couple of housekeeping rules. Luckily, there's no kind of boring fire, health and safety thing, but we do have a couple of Zoom things to cover. Firstly, apologies if our internets go awry. We are reliant on household internet, and I'm sure you're all aware that sometimes this can go a bit wrong, but fingers crossed today it will be fine. We're also recording this so we can share with those patrons who are unable to join us today. So just wanted to make you aware of that. If you could also all please remain muted throughout, that would be great, and helps with kind of any feedback. And if you do have any questions, Andrew is going to be doing a bit of a Q&A after his talk. If you do have any questions throughout it, please pop it in the Q&A chat, which can be found along the bottom bar. And I'll be keeping an eye on that. So I can pass on any questions that we have to Andrew towards the end. That's it from me at the moment, but I'm really pleased to welcome Andrew to this conversation, and thank you all for joining us again, and I'll see you a little later on. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And seems very strange talking to you all by addressing my PC. So it's always that strange moment that you hope that you still have reception, otherwise you're sitting in an empty room talking to yourself. But hopefully that's not the case. I'm going to do a short presentation in a moment to give you a bit of the history of the Intercity 125 or high-speed train. But I thought I might just start off by showing you something, because I think most of you will know that last year we were very fortunate to take into the collection the first production power car of the HST 43002. And it was a great moment to see it arrive in the Great Hall, and it takes pride of place even today. Well, not many people can see it, of course, at the moment, on the turntable at Great Hall, which I'll come into in a moment. But it's a kind of lifetime's ambition for me, almost, to see that fulfilled, because way back in around about 1977, when I was a little boy, I was given this for my Christmas, and it is 43002. So very power car. It's now in the Great Hall. So I still have this one, but now we've got the real one in the collection. So that's a really nice thing for me. Anyway, I will now endeavour to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. If there's any problems with any of this, I'm sure somebody will give me a call just to let me know. But so we've looked at the model that I held in my hands there. So hopefully I can now move the to see the real thing sitting on the turntable. Just in case you forgot what the National Rail Museum looked like, here's a nice view of the Great Hall. But the Intercity 125, it's become an iconic train. But of course, originally it was conceived as a stopgap measure, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But it became known as the journey shrinker, or the changing shape of rail. Its distinctive shape here, very, very different. You can just see in the corner of this picture, in the left-hand side, Evening Star, which is only what, about 15 years younger than the HST. So very, very different, of course, in conception and how they look. But this stopgap train later became known as the train that saved Britain's railways, and it's still incredibly with us today, some 44 years and counting since it first entered service. So it's not just on view in the National Railway Museum, but still very much a mainstay of the national network. But really, to discover more of the story, we need to go back into the 1960s to Derby and the Rail Technical Centre, which was established by British Rail in the early 1960s. And this was probably the world's leading research centre for railway development, something that we perhaps have forgotten about in this country today. But in the 1960s and 70s, Britain was at the forefront of some really cutting-edge research and engineering testing, which was done in Derby. And a lot of this originally was to help the railways adapt to the challenges that have been faced by road transportation and air. Of course, the old network was creaking at the seams. The modernisation programme, the 1950s, 1955, hadn't quite done what it had intended to do. And there was a real concern that Britain's railways had no future. And a young engineer was brought in from the aerospace industry, a guy called Alan Wickens, who we'll come into in a moment, to try and resolve the issues of how you could speed up the railway. And part of the problem was that wagons, the old four-wheeled wagons, weren't able to travel at any great speed on the railway network, holding up the ever faster diesel and electric trains that were being introduced at the time. So a series of tests were done to design a wagon base that would enable speeds to go faster, but also to stop the problem that wagons had of toppling over or coming off the track, hunting, as it was known, by going too fast around corners. And there's some amazing experiments were done in Derby using this test vehicle you can see in the top corner here, HSFV high-speed freight vehicle, which is now actually in the National Collection and is up at Locomotion at Shildon. And that work did lead to improvements in bogie design, improvements in designs of track and layouts and so on. But also made British Rail realise that you could transfer that to high-speed trains as well, to make trains much faster and help them compete with rail and with road, and particularly with air. And here we have Alan Wickens, young Alan Wickens, with a model of what was billed as the advanced passenger train, the train that was truly revolutionary, that would transform Britain's rail network and would eventually see whole fleets of APTs running across the country at speeds of up to 250 miles per hour. But this was such a revolutionary train that you actually needed something in the interim to ensure that British Rail did not fall so far behind other forms of competition. And that's where the HST comes in. So a more conventional train, perhaps, but it was tasked with this chap here, Terry Miller. Sorry, the picture isn't particularly great, but TCB Miller, who was the your British Rail's chief engineer of traction and rolling stock, and he was tasked with the idea of coming up with a conventional train that could travel at these high speeds, up to 125 miles per hour, to ensure that Britain's railways remained relevant while the APT was progressed with the APT design. Now, Miller's background was quite interesting. It goes back to the days of steam. Of course, this was still in the 1960s. He had been an apprentice to Sir Nigel Gresley, and you actually see some similarities with what Gresley was doing with the A4s and the coronation sets to the sort of emerging design ideas of the HST. Of course, the streamlining is a key part of that. The very distinctive front end of an A4, very distinctive front end of an HST, certainly symbolised speed and beautiful design. The coronation sets, of course, were streamlined at both ends. The back end was the Beaver Tail Saloon, the coronation set here, which you see in a picture from our Doncaster Works collection. So while there was no power at that end, you had effectively a streamlined train front and back. And that must have been partly what was in Miller's mind as he looked to develop the HST concept in the 1960s. Another thing that was an inspiration too was this the famous Blue Pullman, which took over the Midland Pullman services in 1960. Now, technologically, engineering-wise, it did have its issues, and it wasn't the fastest train in terms of the speeds that the HST would get up to. These would do sort of 90 miles per hour in service. But the concept of having a locomotive effectively at either end of the train with the carriages sandwiched in between was seen with the Blue Pullman. And of course, it was a stylish train as well. And that's got another connection to the HST story, because the industrial designer who shaped the Blue Pullman, this chap on the left-hand side, is called Jack Howe. Jack Howe is an incredible designer. He had worked with a chap called Maxwell Fry, who he'd been apprenticed to Maxwell Fry. And Maxwell Fry himself is a very key figure in the Bauhaus movement. He'd worked with Walter Gropius, the founder of Bauhaus. So that's a kind of technical design background to things like the high-speed train and the Blue Pullman. And a direct connection to the HST is that Jack Howe took on a young apprentice in the 1960s, a chap called Kenneth Grange, who you see here on the right-hand side. We'll come on to him in a moment, but he becomes a key part of the HST story. So there is actually a direct link to the Bauhaus movement and the HST as well, which is quite a nice one, something that maybe isn't picked up on too much. The original concept of the HST in terms of its design actually falls to a different designer, the chap here in the left-hand corner called Athol Hill. Now, Hill was a graduate of Glasgow School of Art. He was a silversmith by background and became involved with British Rail in the 1960s as part of their very small design team. And he was tasked with all sorts of designs for new carriages and locomotives, and was actually the designer of the Mark III carriage, which becomes the stock carriage that was used on the high-speed train sets and in other sets too, of course. But he also came up with a concept for the HST in the late 60s, just to get people excited about the potential of it. And this is Hill's scheme from, I think, 1968. Now, Hill was very, very busy because the HST, as I sort of alluded to, was not the key priority for BR. That was the APT. So Hill was tasked with designing the APT. And it's down to Athol Hill that we have the famous design of the experimental advanced passenger train itself, of course, in the National Collection. So another industrial designer was brought in, and that's where Kenneth Grange comes into our story. Now, his background, other than his apprenticeship with Jack Howe, wasn't really with any sort of connection to the railways. He was famous for all sorts of things, the companies he'd worked for. Anglepoise lamps, there's a Kenneth Grange Anglepoise lamp here. The Kodak Instamatic camera that he designed for Kodak, famously the Kenwood Chef, the Wilkinson sword razors that you see there. For the Royal Mail, he designed a new pillar box. Morphy Richards, he designed kettles and irons, and also the wonderful Venner parking meter was also one of Kenneth Grange's, and many other things besides. He's still in his early 90s, still designing. One of the most recent designs has been a redesign of the famous British pint glass, which he did about 2 years ago. So he's a remarkable designer. But he was brought in to really help give the HST a bit more of a look to it, because the original concept, as you can see from the image in the bottom right-hand side there of the front end of the HST, wasn't especially exciting. Grange overstepped the mark in some ways, because he was sort of given the contract to come up with a livery for the HST and also some smaller design work, but he kind of went a lot further, because he was really quite appalled by the initial design ideas for the high-speed trains. So started to come up with more adventurous design, shall we say, but certainly practical too. Unbeknown to BR, he'd managed to secure access to University College London to use their wind tunnelling testing units. He used to bribe the porter, apparently, on the door to help him get in after hours, effectively, to test out his models in the wind testing facilities that they had there. And here's one of those models with the line showing the aerodynamics of what became the prototype high-speed train, which is also Kenneth Grange as his design, incidentally. And that led to the production of this prototype set here under construction in the early 1970s. And you can see here from this image, it's not a great image in terms of the quality, but you can see there beside one of the current diesels, as it were, of British Rail at the time, just how different the HST was going to look to the trains that people were familiar with in this country. Very, very futuristic in terms of its design. And parallel to that, the APT experimental program was underway. So you then had the future was starting to emerge, the stopgap high-speed train and the train of the future, the advanced passenger train, seen here together at Swindon in 1973. These are both record breakers, or become on the way to become record breakers at this time. The HST, or HSDT as it was known, high-speed diesel train, reached a then world record speed for diesel traction of 143 miles per hour, while the APT was able to do a speed of 155 miles per hour, a then British record. So, you know, the the schemes and ambitions that British Rail had had in the 1960s for HST and APT really look like bearing fruit in the early 70s. As you can see with these two fantastic prototypes, both now represented in the National Collection. And the HST, as I mentioned before, had standard carriages, Mark III carriages, the next step up, designed by Athol Hill in terms of the shape of these carriages. These are carriages were step up in comfort from anything that had been seen in British Railways before, including, of course, the air conditioning, which had come in with the Mark II-D carriages a few years earlier, but much longer than those carriages. These are 9 foot longer at 75 feet. And the bogies and so on give an incredibly smooth ride, as they still do today. In fact, many people say that actually nothing, even in modern fleets, has ever come close to matching the comforts of a Mark III carriage. So there you have the essentials of the prototype train. And the prototype itself then gets used for has another use as well. Just a sort of little sidetrack here, because it ties in with our latest acquisition at the NRM. Two of those Mark III carriages from the prototype set were then taken out of the prototype set and turned into the royal apartments for Prince Philip. One carriage for Prince Philip and the other carriage for the Queen herself. And they are both still in the royal train to this day. And recently we acquired a couple of Hugh Casson's original concept drawings for those carriages for the apartments. So this is actually the inside of a Mark III carriage from the high-speed train prototype, which is actually the Queen's bedroom, still in use on the royal train to this day. And Hugh Casson, the designer who did a lot of design work for the Queen, worked closely with Athol Hill, British Rail's designer, on this particular scheme. So that's a nice little sidetrack and spin-off from the high-speed train prototype story. You've noticed, of course, famously, the prototype still had buffers, and Kenneth Grange had asked what the buffers were for. And an engineer had said to him at Derby, said, well, actually, you don't need them because you've got 2 power cars at one at Isle End. So actually you could do away with them. So that was a great boon for Kenneth Grange, and this system to enable failed or dead power cars to be hooked up was sort of concealed within the front end of the production HST. So that helped give it that unique shape. Some of you may recognise the young man in this picture. This is Adrian Shooter, who for several years was on the NRM's advisory board, a very well-known figure in railway circles, and he was actually early in his career was given the role of managing Heaton Depot just outside Newcastle, which is one of the main HST bases, which was set up at the time of the HST being introduced in the 1970s. So Grange's design has evolved into what we almost know as HST today. The big difference, as you'll see in this contemporary model, lies with the livery. You'll see it's actually got a lot of black in here, and the original power car 43002 was turned out at Derby Works with the black colour scheme, but that was soon replaced by the more familiar blue that we see today. So there were still changes being made quite up to the close to the introduction of the train, but we now have the remarkable train and its shape. And inside it, of course, you have those incredible, for those of you who remember them, the incredibly noisy Paxman Valenta engines, which, God, they could deafen you, as well as choke you, of course, with the fug of diesel fumes that they would send up as the train was about to depart stations like King's Cross. But they're truly remarkable that within such a short space of time, this fast, powerful, comfortable train was able to be introduced on the Western Main Line in 1976. And with those carriages as well, a new era in rail travel was dawning on Britain's railways, and probably not a moment too soon. So the power cars have all sorts of interesting innovations in them. The moulded plastic, heavily robust plastic cab ends that you see here, and of course enabled the futuristic shapes to be developed. And here's the production line here. And some of you would know that we have one of those cabs on the floor of the Great Hall in York. That is actually what a genuine, it's not a mock-up, it's a genuine HST cab that came off the production line as a spare, which we've had on display for a number of years. The final train itself made a hugely striking impression, sometimes known as a flying banana because of the yellow predominance of the yellow in the power car ends, And I can recall these coming into service when I was a young kid growing up in a Hitchin on the East Coast Main Line. Our school looked down from a distance onto East Coast Main Line, and I remember myself and some excited classmates would run to the window shouting 125. And when we saw these going past the window in 1978, when the train was introduced, we got into a lot of trouble from our teacher for doing that, as you can imagine. Now, British Rail knew that they had a real winner here with this train, and Peter Parker, the brilliant chairman of British Rail at the time, a key figure in the HST project, really pushed the train, and there was lots of publicity materials were produced at the time. And the train also got an unexpected boost because the then Prime Minister, James Callaghan, became a great fan of the 125 when it was introduced on services between Cardiff and London Paddington, because it meant he could get back to Wales and back to Cardiff from Downing Street at weekends and so on. And it became a frequent traveller on the 125, and here he is sitting in first class, signing autographs for some young passengers on that train. So that was a great boost to have obviously the Prime Minister behind this programme as well. Then you had this incredibly fantastic publicity programme that the British Rail put out to really excite people about the 125, and you can really see it here, I think, with the quality that the design itself really lends itself to adverts that really can excite people. That's just it's a locomotive that really screams power, and a wonderful splash of colour as well there too. Just really fantastic introduction. Change in shape of rail, the journey shrinker, all the terms that were then used to really play on the fact that this was a train of speed. You know, the Western advert there that you see on the left-hand side shows that they've given journey times. Journey times, incidentally, that even in more recent times actually weren't being matched to the speeds that were happening in the 1970s. But it wasn't just about speed, of course, as well. It was about looking at the convenience of the train. Also, the Buffet Bar 125. It's strange to think about now, but that was very much futuristic to be able to get a microwave burger and chips on a train at the time. You know, that seemed to be a wonderful thing, particularly for younger people. You know, today we would sort of scorn a lot of that sort of catering stuff, no doubt. But it was very exciting for a lot of people at the time. And British Rail really played on that fact that the high comfort train, first class, you had the seats that could recline back. You had plenty of leg room, lots of space to do work, and plenty of space, of course, in the second class carriages. Also, you had the doors that would automatically open between the carriages, something we take for granted now, but hadn't been possible before, which meant that you could, of course, go up to the buffet and come back with your tray of microwave burger and chips or whatever, and without having to fiddle about trying to open doors to get back into the carriage. So that really helped to transform travel. It does seem strange that the slam doors were kept on the outside of the train, something that has caused lots of issues ever since to the Mark III carriages, particularly as the technology existed at the time to have automatic opening doors. But that was maybe one of the few downfalls of the design itself. And they played a lot on what you could get. So it wasn't just about the convenience. You had the opportunity on the longer distance journey to sit down to a proper meal. The breakfast on the on Intercity at that time was reckoned by some to be perhaps the best breakfast you could get in Britain at the time. So I mean, obviously there's a lot of lots of stories about British Rail catering, and of course Prue Leith was brought in to sort out British Rail catering by Peter Parker. But the breakfasts were superb, and I can well remember travelling on those trains because my father worked on the railways. So occasionally we did get a first class seat back up to Edinburgh to visit relatives from getting on the train at Stevenage to enjoy one of those breakfasts. Very good fun. Indeed. And of course, it wasn't just about the more relaxed sit-down meals. Very popular was the buffet car itself, which had a bar which contained draft beer, draft beer and lager. Supposedly the first ever be served on Britain's railways, although there were experiments in the 1960s. I understand in Scotland on some services with draft beer, but this was a real innovation. Although people did complain about the price of the beer, so the draft beer didn't last for too long. in terms of actually being served. But again, it was another example of how innovation and gimmickry was being used. The micro ovens, or microwave ovens as we would know them, certainly helped make that train lighter as well. You didn't have all the traditional kitchen equipment that would weigh down traditional trains as well. So that certainly helped with the speed and flexibility of the 125 itself. And then they needed proper maintenance. They were going further and faster than any train had gone before on Britain's rail network. And so they needed a good system of maintenance and repair overnight at a number of depots, some of which were created specially, or new buildings were created specially for them. This again is at Heaton Depot outside Newcastle in around about 1978. And I was speaking to Adrian about this a couple of years ago. He told me that at the time, one of the big problems was that a lot of the electrics on the HST meant that some of the traditional engineers working on the railways at the time didn't necessarily have some of the skills to work on this. And he was actually quite fortunate in the fact that the shipbuilding industry in the time was, of course, starting to decline, sadly, at this time. But it did mean that there were a number of electricians from the Swan Hunter shipyards who were looking for work. And a lot of them found work for British Rail at Heaton Depot to work on the HST. So, yeah, it's a new ways of working starting to come in as well. So everything about the 125 had to have some kind of work or change associated with it. So how does it compare with other trains at the time? Well, it did give Britain the fastest regular services in Europe, and you weren't paying extra money to go on those trains either. On high-speed services in other parts of Europe, you were having to pay supplements, not on the HST. In Germany, West Germany, they were still operating steam locomotives, and up until 1978, the year in which the HST was introduced on the East Coast Main Line. So very, very futuristic. And there was only one train that could regularly beat the high-speed train in service in the late 70s, and that was the Shinkansen, the famous Japanese bullet train. But even then, its top speed for much of the 70s was only 130 miles per hour, only 5 miles per hour more than the speed of the HST. Now, one HST unit cost £850,000 to make in the 1970s. Shinkansen was considerably more expensive. And then you had the upkeep of the Shinkansen special track and so on. So actually, the HST was value for money like nothing else in the railway industry, and has gone on to prove itself to probably be the most financially successful a train the world has ever seen because of the outlay and the service that it's given. But in the late 1970s, only the Shinkansen could beat the HST for some long distance town to town journey times. And then, even then, on one special occasion, British Rail actually broke the world record of beating even the Shinkansen in the late 70s for a run between, I think, Paddington and Cheltenham. So the train was kept relevant. There were upgrades done to it, re-liveried. Some turned into Pullman services as well. All about attracting people off of air travel or travelling by road. So very, very important for business travel, some of these Pullman services that BR Intercity introduced in the 1980s. But it was a great record breaker in other ways too. Here's a scene that some of you may have seen before. Some of you may even have been watching this. This is 1985. And here's the 27th of September 1985, the 10th anniversary of the opening of the NRM. And here we see a special 125 service going non-stop from Newcastle to London, then setting a world diesel record for the fastest journey time of such a distance. It averaged a speed of 115.4 miles per hour from Newcastle to London, touching 144 miles per hour in part of that journey, which was then a world diesel record. And here we see Mallard on its, at the time it was getting put back into steam, Mallard and Stirling single, given a celebratory toot each as the record-breaking train passes. And the day after that record run, that leading power car was named National Rail Museum the first 10 years. And later, that nameplate was taken off, but Virgin Trains, for the 40th anniversary, put the name, renamed that power car National Rail Museum 40 years. So we've got a great affinity to that particular power car. It's still in service today. I'll come into that later on in the talk. So that's our record-breaking NRM liveried car there in the Virgin days in 2015. Now, it wasn't just about Britain. The HST concept and design was sold to Australia as well. Commonwealth Engineering of Australia tendered for the long distance train building contract in Australia in the 1970s, and using the HST power cars with British Rail specification permissions, and were awarded that long distance contract. And today the XPT is still the Australian long distance train. So an HST derivative finding great success in Australia. Now it also has Paxman Valenta engines, but they were only 2,000 horsepower rather than the 2,250 horsepower that the 125 had in the UK. So these weren't as fast. But then the track system in Australia doesn't allow such high speeds either. But it shows you the fame and success of the HST wasn't just confined to Britain. And the Mark III carriages found use elsewhere, including in the Republic of Ireland. So what of the APT then? The whole concept had been for the APT to come in, take over from the HST after a few years on not just the East Coast Main Line, but the West Coast Main Line and the Western Main Line. But without going into all the details, I'm sure most of you will be aware of some of the sort of sagas that took place in the development of APT in the 1970s. Real sorry sagas, because it really was a remarkable train in many, many ways, and one to be persevered with, as the Italians, who acquired a lot of technology, discovered very successfully, which is why we've now got Pendolinos in the West Coast Main Line that are derived from the APT. The APT progress was a lot slower than anticipated, and then the needs changed anyway. By the 1980s, the needs of Britain's railways were deemed to be different to what they had been in the 1960s and 70s. And so the APT concept was starting to become less relevant, despite the fact that the prototype APT had been introduced into service temporarily in the early 1980s, with some successes, but also a lot of difficulties and challenges as well, which put the whole APT project under threat. But there still existed a need for a high-speed electric vehicle, and that the APT concept may have died with British Rail at least, but a lot of its learning and engineering went into another project, the Intercity 225, which is seen here at York Station, the very first Class 91, which heads up the sort of power of those 225 units. Encompasses a lot of APT technology. The Mark IV carriages were designed with tilt profile, designed to tilt, although they never have done in service. And these then came to replace the HST, at least for the theory, on the East Coast Main Line. But of course, services between London King's Cross and Aberdeen and Inverness could not use these services, could not use the services of the 225 because there was no electric wires north of Edinburgh. And so the HST stayed in use on the East Coast Main Line, where it was introduced in 1978, and of course was the mainstay on the Western Main Line, where it had been introduced in 1976. So still, while everyone was expecting the HST to be cascaded teleservices, still the HST was doing long-distance, high-speed runs on those two main lines, and also working across the country on cross-country routes as well. So still very, very important, even though by this stage, it was over 20 years old. And we should pause just for a moment as well to, obviously with a train of such longevity in service, not everything was a sort of glorious story. There were several crashes that involved HSTs, and most devastatingly at Ladbroke Grove in 1999, when 31 people lost their lives, including the driver of that HST service, Brian Cooper, who's commemorated on the nameplates which went onto an HST power car. And the spare plate came into the National Collection. And the next time you're in the warehouse or the North Shed in NRM, when you get a chance to go back there, do look out for that nameplate, which is on the wall in that space of the museum. So the trains are still going. British Rail itself is gone, but the HST remains a mainstay of the system. But it gets, even though those are re-engineered by Brush in the early 2000s, it's becoming increasingly clear that you can't keep running the HSTs on the services forevermore. Well, you could, but the need for a new train was coming in, and the Intercity Express program was brought about. Took a long time for those trains to be developed, much longer than the HST concept did, and that's what led to the IET, Intercity Express train, or the Intercity Express program, better known on the East Coast Main Line as the Azuma. And so suddenly you were starting to be faced with what was the reality that the HST was going to be phased out on the Western Main Line and then on the East Coast Main Line itself, the sort of mainstays of the service for 40 years for a high-speed train. So we first see that on the Great Western Railway, as it became known, once again. But say GWR was very, very conscious of the affection that their passengers had for the 125, and so they kind of hark back to that with their part of their advertising campaign here. Look what you gain when you travel by train, showing the advantages of the new services, something that BR had played on in the 1970s and then again in the 1980s with the refurbished HST sets. And the affection that the train has had, amongst railway workers as well as passengers is phenomenal, probably more than any other locomotive or train in British railway history. And those new trains have a lot to live up to. A lot of people complain that they're nowhere near as comfortable. They don't have decent catering in the way that the 125s have had and so on, as I've said, on some of the GWR routes. So, but it's only now with those new Hitachi GWR trains that the now starting to enter the fuel potential, that the actual speeds that were being done by the HST as a matter of course in the 1970s are being matched and beaten. Some 40 odd years on. So again, testimony to just how fantastic the HST has been. It was a great pleasure to join the last HST GWR service out of Paddington last year. And I got to meet Kenneth Grange again. And here's Kenneth standing in front of the power car, his name, at Paddington on that momentous evening. It's a Saturday, and every platform in Paddington had an HST in the station. It was really fantastic. The top end of the station, which you can't see, there was about 3,000 people had gathered to watch the train go out with the power car at the end. It also reminds me that you'll see on the platform there, you'll see the yellow line, which is common, of course, across all platforms. But I remember as a kid being fascinated by these yellow lines appearing on stations on the East Coast Main Line, only to find out that it was because of the HST, because of the speeds that it would go through stations. You had to stand behind the yellow line because you could be dragged, of course, towards the speeding train by the forces that it gave off. So again, the changing sort of face of rail had a change in face in other aspects too, and that yellow line's become kind of synonymous now with just stand behind it, not just about standing behind for fast trains coming through stations like Grantham. So the GWR said farewell, and then it was the turn of the East Coast Main Line, LNAR, who did a special train. Now, I'm very pleased to say the NRM was heavily involved with both those farewell occasions, and it was actually our idea to repaint the whole set in the original blue-grey Intercity 125 livery. So that was something that the museum helped greatly with LNAR on. And I was very fortunate to join one of the one leg from Waverley Station to Leeds in December last year, or coming up for a year now. Seems incredible how time's flown this year. And the attention to detail is fantastic. I just wanted to mention this because Ian Hewitt from Heritage Painting, the company that painted Flying Scotsman for us in 2016, did an incredible job on this. This is not vinyls. This was a proper paint job. And Ian's team did a wonderful job at Craig and Tinney Depot to get that colour scheme exactly right. And it's with great sadness that Ian's announced his retirement. He's still a very young man, but illness has forced him to retire. And hopefully his business will continue in some way. But great testimony to the work and skills of Ian Hewitt to deck out that train in such fashion. And it was incredible being on that journey, just the amount of affection that was shown by the LNAR staff that worked on that train. Here's the driver even dug out his old BR uniform, which remarkably still fitted him. He looks in very good shape. I don't think I could fit into something that was 30 years old. But that was a really wonderful touch as well from the driver. And great crowds that followed us on that journey. And on the inside of the train as well, we'd helped out LNAR, gone to great effort to give some flavour back to the 1970s. So a lot of the old posters were reproduced from our collection. And then the display notices there using the Intercity 125 brand name as well, which is really lovely to see again, because of course it's something that had fallen out of use by the rail companies in privatised era. That leg that last journey finished at King's Cross the following day with a special run from Leeds into King's Cross. Huge crowds there. And it was fantastic to see that Kenneth Grange managed to make that. You might not get that from the photograph, but he's actually 91 years of age. He's absolutely remarkable man, and still working. And of course, he was still travelling into London on high-speed trains up until their withdrawal, because he still has an office in London. So, and he says out of everything that he's ever designed, the HST is his favourite. So, it's a real testimony, given his remarkable track record. So you'd think that was the end of it. That was the last LNER service into King's Cross with an HST, but actually you still get HSTs at King's Cross from time to time, the one that's owned by Network Rail. The rail measurement train, the Flying Banana, or Dr. Yellow, which you see here. So there's one HST that you will see in King's Cross from time to time. GWR have even held on for some regional services. They're Castle classes, and they're calling it the converted smaller formation high-speed trains, but still in use on the GWR. Incidentally, the GWR current logo was designed, inspired by the 1930s GWR logo, but designed by Pentagram, which was a famous design company established by Kenneth Grange in the 1960s. GWR didn't actually realise the connection until after they'd actually commissioned Pentagram, but we're very pleased to know about the connection there. Big difference, of course, on those trains and current HST units is that the slam doors have been largely got rid of and replaced with the automatic doors, which made a huge difference to those trains. Certainly not as drafty as they used to be. East Midlands still have HSTs running for at least another couple of years, including this former LNER Virgin /Virgin power car, hence the red livery. And this is the NRM named power car. The name and the vinyls were stripped off, but this is the record-breaking National Rail Museum 40 years power car, currently in service on East Midland Railway. Cross country, you can get HSTs, of course. And most recently, ScotRail has introduced the Inter-7 City service. The Intercity name come back into effect with 4 and 5 car services. And I thought this one was topical because the very nice livery that ScotRail have put these into includes, in this case, a face mask for that particular power car. So basically, you can still get an HST from the south of England all the way to the north of Scotland. You will have to change services from time to time. You can get them for the Midlands as well. So the sort of death of the HST, as you might have expected from some of the coverage that was given to the withdrawal of services by GWR and by LNER, has been much exaggerated. And again, another fantastic testimony to these trains that they're still going to be running possibly way into the 50s and their 60s in terms of their age. Again, just coming back to the point, has there ever been a train that was such great value for money than the high-speed train itself? British Rail was much maligned, but what a remarkable project that was. It's given huge value for money over the last 45 years. And we've even got this remarkable latest version of the HST. And I thought it was quite a nice way just to start to round things up, because it brings things back to that Blue Pullman story, the Jack House story, the designer of the Blue Pullman, and Kenneth Grange himself. Now, none of the Blue Pullmans survived, of course. They were all scrapped. So Jeremy Hoskin, his company, Locomotive Services Limited, has brought an HST set, and Lee put it into the Midland Pullman livery to give something of the flavour of that for special charter trains. So here is an HST masquerading as a Blue Pullman, and that will be doing all sorts of exciting trips over the next few years. So do look out for that on the main line. And one of the great advantages of an HST for charter trips, of course, is not like a steam locomotive like Flying Scotsman, which will hold things up on the main line because it's only allowed to do 75 miles per hour. Of course, the HST charter trains can do the full 125, so very good at getting out of the way and keeping the pathway clear, as it were. So let's just finish off with what we've got at the NRM. So we're very fortunate that we got the first production power car named after Sir Kenneth Grange into the museum. GWR did a fantastic job of representing it for us. It was put back into its original livery back in 2016, and they revinyled it for us before it came into the museum to make it look absolutely as immaculate as it could be. Kenneth himself is very proud of the fact that that one of his power cars is in what he calls the Cathedral of Railways, and here he is when the power car first came into the museum for an event in 2016. Kenneth himself has been awarded a fellowship of the Science Museum Group. This was done, I think this was earlier this year or late last year. The day Mary Archer, Chair of the Board of Trustees, presenting Ken with this certificate to become a fellow of the group itself, which is a wonderful thing. But it's not just the power car that we've got in the collection. On the right-hand side of the picture, you'll see a buffet car from a former LNAR HST stock. This is buffet car 4073, and it's the most original of all the surviving Mark III carriages that served in HST sets. It still has the original 1970s seats inside there. So we were very keen to get something with as much originality as possible. And then you'll see another example of British Rail engineering advances that were sort of pioneered at Derby, the Pacer train on the left-hand side there, and in the centre, the Class 306, which has a connection to Nigel Gresley, and through that to Terry Miller, of course, with the HST as well. So that carriage is up at Shildon. And also at Shildon, we have the one of the power cars from the original prototype set. And that's very appropriate because in 1975, 150th anniversary of Stockton Darlington Railway, the famous cavalcade celebrating Britain's railways, which was a cavalcade of steam. So for all the steam locomotives, the actual last participant in the cavalcade was the HST prototype, seen here on that sunny day at Shildon on the 31st of August, 1975. And it seems appropriate today that that power car is in locomotion, alongside, reunited once again for the first time since the 1970s with the APT power car. And for those of you who love the Deltics which were replaced, of course, in the East Coast Main Line by the HST, we also have the prototype Deltic. So that's the lineup at Shildon at the moment. A rather fantastic thing to see. And of course, at the NRM itself, we have that wonderful, beautiful shape that is so familiar and has proved so popular on the turntable. The power car itself, Sir Kenneth Grange. And just finishing off there, it's just an observation that while this was very much seen as a stopgap train, they're still running today, still very, very important to Britain's railway network to keep Britain's railways moving. They are still the world record holder for diesel traction. In 1987, one HST set got up to a speed of 148 miles per hour, a diesel record which has not been broken yet and maybe never will. So these are record-breaking trains, still in service today, still doing what they were designed to do, still looking fantastic as well, just a timeless design shape. And it's very fortunate, and we're very lucky to have some fantastic examples of the HST programme in the National Collection to this day. So I will now stop sharing my screen. Hopefully that all went okay and there was no technical glitches.
No technical glitches. It worked perfectly. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really interesting, and I think it's wonderful to have you talk so passionately about some of the objects that are kind of a bit more modern in our collection, rather than just talking about steam engines or some of the older diesels as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor to questions, and we've had a few coming in as well while you've been talking, which is great. But firstly, I wanted to start off. I know, well, I get to share an office with you, so I get to hear all of your lovely, amazing stories and your personal connections. I know specifically you really enjoy the HST. So have you got any kind of personal stories or connections or from your own experiences that you might want to share?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, because my father worked for British Rail in the 1970s with the British Railways Board, and one of the jobs he was given was to sort of sell the HST concept to foreign journalists. BR was very proud of it, and he had to go out on special trains, test trains, with lots of journalists to sort of show that. And actually, I'll just put it aside here. So anyone that's working on the HST project got a special tie. Then you can sort of see that there with the famous logo on it. 1970s, so it's quite a wide tie. So that's actually my dad's tie from those trips. And And I remember getting dragged out to Slough Station, and must have been 1976, with my brother and my mum, and we sat in Slough Station waiting for a special HST test train to come through. And we sat there for about 2 hours because it was delayed, and we had no idea when it was going to come through. And the novelty of sitting on Slough platform for 2 hours started to wear off, I have to say. It was very exciting. It's like Mars bars at the time as well, and I think Mars bars were made in Slough. So we managed to eat a few Mars bars while we were there, but eventually it came through. It was very, very exciting. But one of the other stories that I've got about that sort of personal connection, before going to join British Railways Board, my dad worked in York for British Rail Eastern Region, and had been involved in the publicity film in the museum in 1975. And in 1975, the Royal Train was actually the high-speed train prototype. Prince Philip was put on board that and sent up to York from London. So it's designated Royal Train, but unfortunately on the way, one of the power cars went on fire. So you had the Royal Train on fire just outside Welland, I think. And it was actually, my dad working the press side had to hush up the story of the fact the Royal Train had gone on fire. It did delay the train, and they managed to put the fire out, but it meant one of the power cars was then dead. So it had to be pushed by the rear power car. The power was provided by the rear power car all the way to York, which meant it could only do 105 miles per hour than 125. So Prince Philip was late for the museum because of a fire on the HST, but it was a story that was then hushed up. But can you imagine it today, the Royal Train going on fire? It'd be all over the not just the national news, but across the world. So, so very different days, of course.
Yeah, wow, that would have been, yeah, you're completely right. There'd be hashtags and all sorts for that today. Tom has asked, very interesting, about our plans for the Power Cab moving forward, and I suppose this ties into our plans with the wider Vision 2025 project as well. And Tom's asked, is there any plans to kind of open the power car so people can look inside as part of future interpretation, like we do with some of our current cabs?
It's a very good question, Tom. The power car itself, we're very much envisaging as being a key part of the Great Hall redevelopment. It's such an important story. Unfortunately, because of the way the Great Hall is configured, it's very difficult to get more than just a power car in there. It'd be great to have, examples of the Mark III carriage, for example. We'll do something of that at Shildon. Some very exciting things we can do there. How we present the power car itself, the cab is very, very interesting. Difficult to get access to, of course, without platformed access for a lot of people. One thing we could be looking at is that cab that I talked about during the talk, the actual production cab that we have. Which it does have a fully fitted out interior as well. That was open to the public back in the 1980s, but I think it got quite a lot of excitement from children going in there, and it got a bit of damage, so we say. So we need to sort of figure out a way in which we can open up. But also, it doesn't have things like the original engine, of course, the Paxman Blender engine. But to open up in some way is something that would be good to do. It could be quite a challenge with the cab access, I have to say, with the actual power car itself. Not insurmountable, that's something we'll be looking at. Just generally, we're looking at what vehicles we can access and what access we can provide. So it could be we could provide some sort of occasional access to things like that. It would be good to open to be able to have that as an opportunity. But there's certainly something around that cab that's in Great Hall as well, where we can maybe make more of in terms of getting access into to see what the cab itself was like.
Cool. And we've got another question about the downfalls of the HST design. You obviously mentioned the doors, even though that the technology was there to have the kind of automatic doors. Was there anything else that people deemed that maybe were an unsuccessful to the design when it originally came out?
Yeah, well, there were quite a few things that not sure we really want to go into. It's after lunch, so it's probably okay. The toilets were a real problem. They actually discovered originally that actually there was no proper ventilation in the toilets, so that if the train got stuck in a tunnel and the door locked and you couldn't get the door open, there was a potential chance of suffocating to death after about 25 minutes. So they had to sort of like reconfigure that, and they also discovered that going through the tunnel originally in the toilets, because of the effect of the aerodynamics and the speed going through the tunnel, and it created a sort of vacuum, and that sent the water shooting out of the toilet. So it gave people a fright of water shooting out of the toilets when it was going through a tunnel. But also, as you'll know, if you've ever sat on HST when it's past another fast train, if you're on that same side and you've got a cup of tea or something, your tea or whatever you're drinking, if it's something stronger, has a terrible habit of jumping out of the glass or out of the mug. That's a terrible downside of it. There's also another terrible downside of the HST, which I won't go into because it is a bit grim. But let's just say if you're ever on a slam door HST, if you can get somebody else to open the door for you, get them to open it. Try not to open it.
Yeah, top tip there. Thank you.
for reasons that yes, you wouldn't want to know.
No, I'm sure. We've got another question asking about whether there was a simulator built for training drivers specifically for the HST.
I don't think there was. What there was a very rigorous testing program, and actually all of the sets, the main test, I think every set for the Western region as well as Eastern region was tested on the racing track between York and Darlington. So drivers got to understand. I mean, a lot of the technology in terms of the cab and so on was familiar. It was still essentially although it was very futuristic in many ways, it was still a traditional locomotive. People think about it being a train set, but actually the Class 43 power cars are locomotives by themselves. So I mean, one of the things was that it was supposed to be designed for one person being in the cab, and the union said that for any service over 100 miles per hour, you should just have two people in it. So the cab would have to be specially designed for having two people in. Doesn't happen now, of course. It's sort of single cab access, but so that was nothing special as far as I'm aware. But one thing, coming back to the downsides, but also to time with the sort of driver story, is that the windscreen had to be designed in such a way to withstand the pressure of somebody throwing a brick at the window. There's lots of vandalism and potential for that in the 1970s, and did happen with other trains. So Pilkington Glass came up with this special single framed piece of glass which was able to provide a really secure window for those cabs. But I'm not aware of any simulator, but certainly a lot of rigorous testing was done.
And because we're running out of time, I've got a kind of final question to ask, and I suppose it's a bigger question. You talked a lot about the HST bringing in a new age of rail travel in terms of, I suppose it was glamorized. There was a buffet car with the microwavable burger and chips and draft beer and all this kind of thing. And then, of course, we've welcomed the IETs with the Azuma on the East Coast and down in GWI first, now Avanti bring it in on the West Coast as well. And I know there's a big debate around the seats aren't as comfy, the buffet cars are smaller. And I suppose, do you think we're now maybe regressing back to a kind of more practical style of travel? Yeah, what's your overall opinion of that kind of change?
Well, some of the travel's a lot. I must say, I mean, I've got more used to the seats. We were very uncomfortable, first of all. I mean, I think, I mean, part of this is actually, I mean, you know, speeding up of services and all the rest of it. I mean, the Azumas, IETs, they're faster, although they're doing 125, the same as HST, they're much faster accelerating and braking. With the digital railway, you'll be able to speed up services, have services running closer together. So, I mean, the idea of having a restaurant car, as the original HSTs had on longer distance services, probably isn't. It'd be nice to see that back again. But I mean, I think it's more about practicality and speed and Wi-Fi capabilities and all the rest of it to help people work now. Now, personally, I prefer the old style, and I think a lot of people still do. And I mean, I think, I mean, coming back, even things like the 225, the Mark IV carriage, I mean, I think a lot of people feel the Mark IV carriage was not a step up from the Mark III carriage. It wasn't as comfortable. And you might sort of say, well, you know, a carriage that was developed in the 1960s and 70s, how can that be more comfortable than some of the things that you see today? But you look at the advantages that things like the Azuma brings, you know, in terms of its acceleration and so on. And we've not seen the full potential of that train yet, and that really will transform things. But what's really interesting is when you see those trains come in, any new train that's come in, I mean, the 225s, people complained about how uncomfortable they were, and of course now people are complaining that the Azumas aren't as comfortable as the 225s. So it's an interesting thing. But yeah, I'll keep some of the personal opinions to myself, and some of it though, just I don't want to offend any of the companies that we work with.
Smart move, thank you, Andrew. Well, this is bringing us up to a 2 o'clock finish. So I just want to say a massive thank you to Andrew for joining us this afternoon and giving us such a fantastic talk. Thank you, Andrew. It was really interesting. And if anyone does have any further questions, burning questions that you had, that we didn't have time to answer, please do forward them on to myself, and I can always kindly ask Andrew if he wouldn't mind answering them, and we can get back to you. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon and spending an hour of your day with us. As restrictions carry on, Abby and I continue to look for new ways that we can keep you engaged with the museum and our collection through our newsletters and online events like this. So if you have any ideas for future events or discussions that you'd like, please do drop me a line and we can see what we can do. We hope we can really see you again in person soon. And during these times, that the support from our patrons is so important. As we lose income through visitors and retail and private hires, donations and especially your patronage are really essential to us and essential to our survival. So thank you so much for continuing to support us. Thank you once again to Andrew. Thank you to you all, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.